interesting because if you read the first few bits of the book, like, you know, Martina features so heavily, but she dies, and she dies off the page. You don't see her die. You don't know how she dies. You just know when the militias come, and they do come, and we know they're going to come. They overrun the camp, and they just they mass murder people. They butcher and butcher and butcher, and there's only a handful of survivors. Sarah being one, Dana being another, and Simon survives with just a horrific head injury. He got shot in the head and has got this brain injury that limits his brain capacity for life. And their mother dies. And the last thing I wanted to note about the camp is she meets two old men there who are very important. She meets oh man,
Albert Gaines.
Sorry, say again.
Albert Gaines.
Yeah, Gaines and Joe, who turns out not to be named Joe. His name is Yusuf Bun Rashad. But Gaines is a sort of an old recruiter who recruits people to young kids mostly, and like the vulnerable. He's one of those recruiters who basically radicalizes people.
Right. And Joss, that quote that you read earlier about like the recruiters and the mechanics of what they did, this is serving as the sort of dry academic explanation for the behavior that we see from Gaines.
Yes, absolutely. Because I think not he himself, but I think it was Yusuf later who says, certain recruiters had certain lines that they'd use on people. I wonder which one he said to you. Which again, it hits Sarah, exactly in the way that it's intended to, because she herself is still in that space of, earlier it says, she was still at that age where she, couldn't comprehend the mechanics or the reasons for a lie, why somebody would say something and not believe it. Right.
Right.
And this guy, basically, he teaches her, he treats her like she's intelligent. She is intelligent, but he's one of the only people who, like, the school there is, it's terrible. And he's, feeding her literally, and he's like giving her honey, which she's never actually had real honey before. And he's feeding her knowledge, and he's speaking with her like she's smart, and like he takes her seriously or whatever. And he's literally grooming her. And when she has this violent
not in a sexual way, it should be very clear.
Sure.
Strictly grooming to be a soldier. Yeah.
Sure. Yes. Sorry, when I say literally, I mean, like, yes, he is grooming her to be a soldier.
Yes.
And he's giving her little tasks and paying her for it, and letting her carry out little tasks like delivering letters. And she trusts him, and he gives her this knife, and you see this like relationship there. And she is like, no, he's not like these other guys. He's very smart. He's not like, she contrasts him with the other soldiers and stuff. Like, it's not like that. And like, of course, from the outside, we're like, oh, this guy's a piece of shit. Like, we realize that.
Well, I don't know. I don't know that I necessarily. Look, he's not a great.
On that.
Okay, well, he's not a great guy. Obviously, right. I'm not out here to defend the character of Albert Gaines, because what he is seeking to do is clearly not really coming from a place of altruism. He's not just wanting to be nice to this kid, but I do think that there's something interesting about the way that he operates that makes him like, I understand where he's coming from, even though I don't think that what he's doing is right. I don't think that we are set up to loathe him necessarily and be like, oh wow, this fucking jag off. He's not in like Christian media, it's not like one of those things where he'd be presented as the evil atheist kind of character, right?
No.
There's
nuance.
There's nuance and complexity there that I think is interesting. Maybe not quite as much as I would have loved to have seen, but also we're seeing this from Sarah's perspective. So we're not privy to his motivations. We see her perspective on what it is that he is doing in a way that to me rang very, very true.
We had just already had that bit that Joss read about the recruiters, I believe, before we meet him. So like that's ringing in my head when we meet him, and I'm like, oh, okay, alarm bells. Like, this is that guy. You are right, though, that he isn't just his character isn't he's a bad guy, but he is. When you notice him, it's not unclear what his motivations are. I guess more along the lines of what I'm saying. Like, it's not unclear that he intends to turn her into a weapon.
Right, which is indelible from the connection.
Do y'all disagree with that?
Well, it's indelible from the connection that he forges with her, I think. And I think just by the very nature of just of how perfectly his life intersects with hers, when he gives her first job, right, to run some money to, we assume, a family who's lost a family member in as one of the rebels in the fighting, right? And he says to her, "Don't worry, this isn't a dare, it's a job. Jobs pay." And she's come now. She's literally just coming off of a dare that she's had to go into
to
this
swim in a river of shit.
this culvert full of exactly. So
River
I mean,
water metaphor, or water motif.
Yes, exactly. You know, that kind of low point in
Drink
her
every
childhood.
time.
Yes. Yes. It kind of twigged something in me that it's the wording of it was just so convenient. But I do also think that there is a genuine sort of connection that transcends the groomer groomie sort of thing, because you only get a glimpse of this much later, but he does have a daughter as well that enters into it, and that's kind of how he says he feels about Sarah. You know, we don't really get a sense after she properly commits to the rebel cause of that sort of thing, but I think it's there a little bit.
He sells her out on behalf of his daughter at one point, which is like, understandable. Like understandable why someone would sell someone out on behalf of saving their family's life. So there's that too. Like the last line he says in the book is he is like saying my daughter. He's like saying they would have had when he's like very old and ancient in that shed at the end of his life. But I guess maybe I'm not sure. I don't know that I agree that the relationship goes beyond him seeing her as a weapon. I mean, he smiles when she's like, I want to kill them, and after family's dead. But like, I also can see why you would see otherwise. I think in the character's head, he may be doing more.
Well, the way I see it is, I think that he thinks that he is providing the best possible future for her.
Sure, yes. That's fair enough.
So like, he sees a world of just relentless pain, suffering, and war. He sees a kid who is very apt for it, who physically is about to become an absolute fucking unit. Yeah. And I think that he is in many ways trying to prepare her for that world. Now, does he also maybe have avaristic motivation in terms of like loyalty and, the extent to which he wants to wield that weapon to his own ends? Sure, maybe. But at the same time, she is searching for something in her life in terms of purpose and motivation. She hasn't found it in the things that the rest of her family is doing, and certainly not her sister. And so she needs a reason to be, and he is giving her that reason.
That's true.
Yes, and he pulls it directly from his history. That is his dad says, the only truly stable profession, right, is blood work, the work of the surgeon, the soldier, the butcher. As long as there's even a single man alive, there's always going to be a use for that sort of thing. So
and he was a U.S. soldier, right? Am I right in that? That's how he met his friend, right, Joe?
Yes, because he fought
he served in Afghanistan, Iraq.
So it says the old war, right? He's in his like 70s, 80s by the end of the book. So when he would have been in the army, right, it would be very late 2020s at the earliest 2030s. So there's some idea.
It was probably in this world some sort of a war that broke out due to the unification of the Boise Union, and the United States sent troops over at that time to try to secure the Gulf. And then if you want to extrapolate from there, I imagine that led to a decrease in military power projection. Maybe they sank a carrier or something like that, which is why, the Navy was not as powerful as they used to be. And I could see that then leading to...
That would have been where he met Joe overseas. And Joe being this, like, this guy who works for the Boerman Empire, and is basically supplying weapons and in different materials to people in the South for reasons we've already mentioned, because they want the U.S. to stay unstable. Because as he says later, and it's kind of like a roll credits moment, when there's an American war, or everyone fights an American war.
Yes.
The results of this war are obviously very important for the world. They obviously have historical merit. He says we used to fight wars with your guns and our blood, and of course now they're fighting the war with our blood and their guns. Irony, of course. And we, a lot of listeners of the show will understand, the U.S.'s relation to the Middle East has not always just been intervention directly, but also, dropping massive amount of arms on volatile situations. I mean, you can look into the formation of the Taliban, Mujahideen, and all that. And so that's like
listen to blowback.
Listen to blowback. Yeah,
Yes.
that's honestly season 4 coming soon. So excited.
Which is
and that's
what
gonna be
makes it
about
so
Afghanistan.
funny, in a dark sort of way, that the
Ironic,
United
sure.
States, well, the United States is eventually loses control of its drone fleet in this setting, right? There's some
Mhm.
sort of
yeah.
there's some
The
sort of
birds.
attack on like the nerve center of its drone fleet, the birds, as people call them, and then you have these drones that are just like, zooming around the whole country, just arbitrarily picking targets. And
Right.
now it's the United States that has that experience of being arbitrarily, hell rained on them,
Which is how Dana eventually dies in
Yes.
just a random bird attack. And by random, I mean truly random. No one was
Right.
at the controls. It's just doing its thing.
In terms of sort of the Bouazizi Union and its relationship with the states at that time, you also get an interesting excerpt here from another one of those like found historical documents or whatever. Remarks by the president of this empire. Which it says is delivered at Ohio State University, not the Ohio State University. I don't know if this man realized the aggression that he made toward the state of Ohio there, but I do appreciate it as a Michigan man myself.
Yeah, we have to. Yeah, my husband's side of the family comes from Michigan, so they would appreciate that as well. Yeah.
But basically, in this speech, he talks about how their union technically will not support either side. It is not the policy of the government to truly provide military support to one of these countries. They want to, maintain the American spirit or whatever. But they at the same time that they are again, he is saying this in a speech to people at Ohio State, so in the Union. My people, the people of the Bouazizi Union, who decades ago demanded from their rulers the very same liberation your revolutionaries once demanded of theirs, stand ready as allies to assist in any way we can. So they're playing both sides, which makes sense. You would expect
they
that.
come out on top. Yeah. And you can almost hear behind that with a very generous loan with very generous interest rates. Like, because that's the position they're in. Yep. And I mean, they even say they're an empire. An empire is what the U.S. used to be. That's like a direct quote, or what we used to be.
Yes, the orchestrator around which like weaker things spin, that Gaines says,
Yep. And again,
China's at play somewhere in there, but we don't hear as much about China. If China's intervening in the war, we don't really know. We just know they're sending over gift ships. As
they mention Russia. And Russia is aligned with the sort of South. I think it's sort of implied that Russia actually is more explicitly supporting the South in this world than the Bouazizi Union is. But again, it's all in the form of humanitarian shipments and then illicit arms drops as well.
And Mexico, meanwhile, just got its old land back, basically.
Right.
With the Mexican protectorate. Not really sure what's going on beyond that, but and I think those are the only countries that are. Europe gets mentioned as it has refugees leaving Europe. Sort of.
There's like a mention of like Zion out west and Mormons doing their own thing.
Mm-hmm. The Mormons are doing something wild in this world.
That tracks. I mean, that's extremely realistic.
Oh, 100%. No, 100%. It's no doubt at all. Okay, well, let me see. So next what happens is they moved after this slaughter, the Southern government. One thing they seem to be really serious about is paying pensions to like widows and widowers and victims of the war. That just seems, since the war is so much in their blood, the idea of the victims of the war, the veterans, the mothers and daughters that left behind are so serious that they they give them massive amounts of, not massive amounts of money, but a lot of money, enough to live on. They give them land. And that's their little family. The three of them move out to this little house. The brother is, of course, he's disabled now, and they've got a caretaker for him, Karina. She is, and she's kind of like refers to herself as the help, but she's also mostly the caretaker of Simon.
From the Bangladeshi Isles.
Yes, and kind of, I'm not quite sure what to make of her. It's very strange that she's like taking care of Simon and then marries him later, but that it is noted as strange as well. Like that's a thing in contention. It's like Sarah is like very mad at her for having this relationship with Simon, that at first she was like, are you sleeping with him? And I was like, oh, that's a terrible thing to accuse her of. And then later I was like, oh wait, was there something to that? I guess so. Or maybe it was later, not sure. But they've got this sort of thing going on while Sarah is spending years basically doing guerrilla work. We don't know everything that she gets up to, but the main thing, the thing that matters the most she gets up to is she kills General Wayland Sr., who is or Wayland, something along those lines. And he's a big wig up north, big wig in the Northern Army. And the sides were kind of cooling. There was talk about peace, and this flares things right back up.
I wanted to note that, you know, we had talked about how El Akkad's background is in, you know, combat journalism and stuff like that.
Yeah.
And the action sequences, I think, are the best written parts of this book.
I feel you on that.
So the massacre at the refugee camp is horrifying. And the reason that it, of course, needs to be that way is for it to provide the motivation for Sarah to continue her basically campaign of revenge against the government that did this to her.
Right, for you to get it, as the reader.
And then in parallel to that, when she goes and she fucking, you know, snipes this general, which is, again, numerous pages of just describing what she has to do, how she has to prep, how she goes out there, the tactics in the field.
What she does with her waist, like everything. Yeah, it's all in there.
And you're cheering her on some level. You're like, fucking get him, you know?
Yeah, and it's interesting because, and then that this has, you know, repercussions of, you know, maybe even the book kind of notes like, this was good for the Southern morale until the North was like, okay, fuck you. We're putting that guy's son in charge of the military and we're going all in. Like, we're bombing the hell out of you. And that guy ends up becoming the president, the son, Wayland Jr. But it is, you know, for her, this moment of victory. She's striking back. It's the highest target. Her friend Marcus kind of fed her the information. No, not too interested in that. I don't know if y'all have much feeling on Marcus.
No,
tie to the past.
Yeah, he comes back a couple more times. I think the real sort of interesting thing about it is how, you know, she is doing most of this clandestinely. This doesn't seem to be, I don't know if either of you got the sense that it was with the official support of the Southern government, but it doesn't seem like it.
No,
I don't think so.
I mean, by the time I think that she does mount that assassination attempt, like the rebels have been largely brought under a single umbrella. There's some tension, I think, between the FSS army and the rebel like irregulars, but the days of her brother, you know, joining the like 10-man Virginia Cavaliers, you know, any of those guys running wild are largely over.
Yeah, because it's basically a privatized, or if not privatized, then like, you know, brought together unofficial like military group under this father and son, the Braggs. A lot of parent and junior in this book. You know, you have Bragg Senior and Bragg Junior. You have Layla Senior and Layla Junior, Wayland Senior, Wayland Junior, Bud Baker Senior and Bud Baker Junior. That's a repeating thing that happens through the book. Not sure what to make of it, but is a thing that continuously is recurring. But you've got these like guys, and they're this book doesn't deal a whole lot, like we said earlier, a lot with class, a whole lot with like capitalists. It doesn't deal a whole lot with like owners and workers. This is a society that has, in a lot of ways, collapsed to the sense of like a lot of people are just like foragers. A lot of people, like the characters in this book, are mostly just living off the state or off of charity. So they really aren't really workers in the sense that they are working for a wage at any point. I guess you can kind of see the Braggs as capitalists if you want to see them as like kind of like Blackwater guys or something, like a mercenary leaders. And there's a little bit of reference to in it when they go to Atlanta to meet these guys that like the rich people live in Atlanta. It has a term for them that was interesting. It refers to them as neo-grandees, as the owners of like the sweatshops and the vertical farms and that stuff.
Because there's no like oil barons.
Talk about property. Sorry, Josh, go say that again.
because there's no like, because you're absolutely right, there's still this owning class, certainly, but there's no like oil barons, right? So even the economic motive, even what the book says about the South shackling itself to this ruinous fuel, even that motivation has kind of disappeared, because nobody's exporting the oil from the United States. That connection to the world, and the petrodollar, all that context for American economic hegemony has been lost.
Yeah, it's not a valuable commodity anymore. Nobody's actually trading in it.
It's spite.
Right. And the South is not really producing much of value at all. Like the fruit and stuff it's doing is mostly, it's not subsistence in the sense of everyone's growing their own thing, but it's like you get the idea that like the food they grow gets immediately eaten by the people around there. There's not a whole lot of export. There's not a lot of cash coming in. They don't have a lot in general. A lot of just the areas that were valuable were scorched, destroyed by climate change, and what they did have, what we currently have, got blown to hell in the first days of fighting.
I also think, Jacob, to your point of like the junior versus senior thing or whatever, he's not interested really in generational wealth accumulation, but what he is interested in is generational cycles of revenge. And that, I think, is more of a narrative thing than it is a commentary on anything sociological or political.
Yeah.
I agree. I'm trying to think of what I want to go into. Like she spends some time in Augusta, which like there's some world building there. And then she's, spend some time with a character that'll come back around later, Layla and Layla Jr. They're in this bar, you see kind of how the world is working, this economy living on gift ships.
They all go to a battle royale. One of the guys gets the last man standing, kills his opponent in the ring.
Yeah. Guy gets fucking killed.
Yes, and it's a northern it's a northern southern sort of representation that we have here. Let me just scroll to it because it's pretty. Here we go. The defending champion, 19-year-old from Hattiesburg named Joshua, who fought under the moniker Wraith. There was a rumor he'd once spent time with the Sovereigns, which was a militia fighting in East Texas when he was only 13. It was a lie invented to blunt another rumor that the fighter was in fact the son of Northerners, right? And then you have this other dude who is his challenger, and so you there's this north-south kind of divide that you can see obliquely, where the northern guy wins pretty decisively, but his challenger refuses to go down and, tries to, open hand slap him, weak as he is, right? And so what does the champ do? He ends up killing him.
I kind of want to read that just because it speaks to, we've talked about the way that he like writes combat and writes violence and leaves you in a pretty visceral place with it, without like always being totally explicit. He leaves a lot of it open to your imagination in terms of what's going on. So, content warning for extreme violence, I guess. As they spoke, the challenger stumbled onto his one working foot. He limped toward the edge of the cage and threw himself against the body of the champ. There was nothing left of him now but weight, and with it he knocked his opponent back against the side of the cage and onto the ground. The champ screamed in pain as he fell. An unsmooth protrusion in the mesh of the cage had cut a deep gash all the way along the length of his chest. Blood poured from the wound and spilled out the boundaries of the ring. In a moment, the champ was standing again. Enraged, he knelt over his motionless opponent and beat him until the trainers in the crowd and all who watched knew he was dead.
Yeah.
Yeah, and not just that he kills him in the ring, right? But that everybody watching knows that he makes an example of him.
Right. Nobody does this to me.
And there is like an interesting moment where, there's the interesting moment of him being like, "What am I supposed to do? The guy won't surrender. I guess I gotta." It's a weird dynamic. You get briefly that Sarah and Layla Jr. have a relationship. There's like
they bone.
There's sex, and it's violent, and Sarah is another reminder that Sarah is a very angry person. And you get that.
It's not a super explicit sex scene, though. I mean,
not at all.
It's more just mechanically being like, this is one of the only people who Sarah feels like she can be sort of soft around. And then the moment that she's done having sex, the walls immediately go back up, because at this point, she is a shell of a person. She is increasingly nothing but, as you said, Jacob, a weapon.
The most interesting part of that scene to me is not the interaction with her and Layla, but the fact that it makes like a whole point of, if she can tell someone else has been in a bed, she doesn't want to lay in it, and
I
she'll
thought that was
strip off
really
the
cool.
sheets.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's interesting because it's not like she's a grossed out person, gets grossed out easily. Earlier in the book, she like pisses her own pants and is fine with it because she has to make the shot. Like, she has this, just, she can't touch other people. She's got whatever. It's like, this is the same person who was able to like stand in human shit, but like has this discomfort with other, like this boundary, which is of course like, the nature of reaction, the nature of radicalization. I found that to be a good detail. And it can't, and she seems like she's got a good thing going. She seems like, she just killed this general guy. Things are going to keep going. She's got another plan to kill a colonel or some shit, and like some big guy. And then boom, North comes in, takes her to a prison in Sugarloaf Mountain in Florida.
Not Sugarloaf up in what, Maine, which is what I thought it was going to be. Was going to be
Minnesota.
Hold on, where is Sugarloaf again?
There's a Sugarloaf in Minnesota.
Sugarloaf ski. Yeah, it's in Maine. It's one of the, in a place like Sugarloaf, being a mountain would actually be a very reasonable place to put a prison of war if you wanted to, because it would be pretty difficult to attack.
Yeah, that's true. And it's I mean, this part is horrific, of course. The prison is brutal.
This is just what they do at Guantanamo, basically.
Yeah, and he covered Guantanamo, so like you can see that in there, and it's being done. That whole fascism is when imperialism comes home kind of thing. That the way tortured, and they don't actually have information on her, on the stuff she really did that they would actually string her up for. It's like they just have her name on a list of hundreds of names.
And notably, her name, her Christian name, right? Her birth name, right? Sarah without the T, right? And that's what immediately sort of twigs in her head. Oh, these people don't know anything.
Yeah, and they don't know her mother's dead, and it's like they like ask her about like a car bombing or something, and she's like, oh, okay. She's like, these people don't know shit, and she holds out for quite a while. And you've got a whole part where it describes some pretty brutal torture, and you've got a whole part where she's straining to see the sea, and she can't, more water. And we should note shortly before this, we already said it, but Dana does die shortly before her kidnapping. We talked about it. It's just another really bad thing that happens to her. I don't honestly have a whole lot to say about it. I think
the girl on the bed ended at the knees. Yes.
That was good. I liked that description. Again, I don't know. I wish I had a little more from Dana. But it's not a huge deal. It's a thing I'm interested in. But this just not there. But she does notably have this idea of, when I die, no matter where they bury me, my ashes or my body or my flesh or whatever becomes of me will end up back in the water eventually, because all rivers are connected, and Dana is in the river, and I will be reunited with Dana. And Dana is like, her comfort person. When she is terrified, she thinks of Dana. When she dreams of Dana, when she's having like a bad dream.
Yeah, in that scene, after she has sex with Layla, Layla leaves, and she wakes up, she sleeps through the night, and then finds herself in the morning wanting to feel something, and so she just imagines her sister there with her in that moment. Not in a sexual way, obviously, just like this is my comfort person way.
Yeah, and they are twins, even though they don't look anything alike, and so like there's something of that in there. But yeah, she eventually does, though, in prison to bring around the water motif, get waterboarded, and that's what breaks her.
And once again, the description of it, I'm not going to read that one, but it lets you know what waterboarding feels like.
Yeah, that's what it does, and that's what they do to people.
Yep. Simulated drowning, and I mean, earlier throughout the book, it's a comfort image of hers, right? Swimming in the Tennessee River and feeling connected to every other body of water, every other every other part of the world in this way, and now they take this fundamental force and they turn it against her.
Yep.
Right. And she then confesses, but she confesses notably to everything, because that's what happens when people get tortured a lot of the time, is they just are like, yep, I did that. I'll sign that. Yep. I agree to all of it.
The thing she doesn't confess to is the thing that she actually did, because they didn't know that she was the one who did that, because it turns out later on in the book, somebody else had confessed to that falsely. I think this is a really clever work of, like, it does a really interesting job here of taking the water motif that we've been hearing throughout, and like you said, pulling it back in a way where her comfort thing is now the thing that is being used to harm her. And so it makes sense that this is what breaks her. This is something that aligns her as a character and what we know about her. And so it breaks our heart to see this happen to her, but it also, I think, makes a really poignant point about the nature of torture and waterboarding specifically, without just being like, torture is bad, okay? Like it helps you get it, I think, in a way that you might not get it just from reading about the horrible things that the United States has done to prisoners of war and others over the course of the many, many years that our great empire has been doing the things it's been doing.
Right, exactly. And she's, spends some more time in prison. She interacts with this guy named Bud, who's just this like really shitty guard, this big terrible guy who's, one of the guys to like threaten her the most, and just has this bad relationship with her. And she's breaks down, and she spends 7 years in that prison. And she's a complete mess. And by the time they let her out because the war's coming to an end, and they're like, hey, there's no point in us having this woman here. It describes her as, she's still big, but she's like, gained fat because she's just sat there, and like, so she's not this like buff, like, strong, lean girl anymore. She's gained fat, and she's hunched over, and her knees are ruined. And she's like grown out hair, which she immediately cuts, but like cuts her own scalp. And I mean, it's pretty horrendous. It's a really, and it even says the crop of women that get off with her, like 3 like kill themselves in like a few weeks.
Did you find this to be like over the top brutal, like I get it, like that's enough of the misery for now kind of thing, or did it work for you?
Honestly, the time that I felt that in the book was not here. I felt that when Dana died a little bit. Because I was like, okay, sure. Dana's dead. Like, that's another bad thing. I can see why you would feel that way. What do you think, Joss? Was it a little much, or do you think it was just like, this is what fucking happens?
Yeah, I accept the stark reality that's on display here. I don't think he belabors the point too much. There's certain bits and pieces of the prose that kind of struck me as a little laying it on too thick. There's one early on about like rebels escaping, going toward this death because, and this text explicitly says, because there's escaping the slow death of, stagnation and boredom at home. And it's just like, just call them walking corpses in search of more comfortable graves. So like, get a little poetic, but like, no, the violence, I don't think was too, I don't think it was injudiciously used.
Okay, I don't think so either. I was just curious because I remember the first time I read the book being like, okay, this is like, I get it. But I didn't really have that reaction this time around. And I wasn't sure if that was just like a me thing or what.
Maybe the years you've just been like, oh, you're just desensitized.
Could be. It's also worth noting that when Sarah gets released from the prison, because the war is over at this point, this is also where we do get what we were mentioning earlier, the like found diary of the Southern recruiter, where he's writing about the manipulation techniques that he uses. So we get that piece as sort of a additional knife after she's been released from this prison where she's just been suffering. Now we also get explicit confirmation that Gaines was just, it's basically his fault that she ended up there because of the manipulative tactics that he used.
Yes, found cause, as it's called.
I thought a lot of I don't know why I thought of V for Vendetta so much after this part. I guess because she gets out of the prison and she's been tortured, and then that's like when she's got. But this is like V for Vendetta if it actually happened. which is she gets out of prison and yeah, maybe she wants to do an act of mass violence. She's not going to get out of prison and be like a liberated person or whatever.
Right.
Yes. Well, and also like, I mean, because the classical conditioning that you see in V for Vendetta like brings the Natalie Portman character around to the cause in question, but you know, I mean, the opposite effect we see here in Sarah, right? By the end of the book, she's been completely stripped of that sort of, you know, she still has the revenge, certainly, Jacob used to say, but she's stripped of sort of the ideological motivation for it by the end.
Yeah.
Yeah, she says fuck the South when she's offered like a medal.
Yes, because it degenerates into a game of everybody else accusing everybody else of being a sellout, right? You know, we see it when the laborers on her brother and her sister-in-law Karina's estate are gossiping about her. They call her Blue Nose, they call her a pocket mouth. Because that's a thing in this setting, you know, people get lynched with their pocket stuffed in their mouths, you know, because they're sellouts, right? And that's now what she's perceived as. You know, even though by the criteria established by the Southern rebels up to this point, you know, she's been their one of their strongest patriots.
Right. She should, by all accounts, be kind of considered like, you know, the saint. But like when she comes back, she no longer embodies that the way she used to. She used to be strong and like terrifying or whatever. And now they'll still like, you know, people will come around and pay respect, but people don't really want to. Her family will, but like others, I don't think are happy to see how she looks. I think, but it except Joseph, or Joe, which his actual name is what, Yusuf.
Yeah.
He sees in her kind of that like, okay, now she's ready to take the big step to do the mass killing of who knows how many people, like
which is interesting to me because she's at the end of it, and by this time, of course, like the political context is that they're talking about reunification, right? The war is finally kind of petered out. There's this 6-year negotiation process from 2089 to 2095, right? And she wouldn't be wrong necessarily to suggest that the leaders of the Free Southern State are kind of sellouts, because there's not. We were talking about this the other day, like they go to the negotiating table, right, and they're more concerned with the aesthetics of it, right? They sweep aside all the yes, they sweep aside all the sort of like economic like preamble to it, and they say, first of all, we don't want to hear the word surrender, right?
Yeah,
there's that.
Yeah,
and, you know, they actually
I'd love to read a little bit of that.
Yeah,
I've got this. This is another one of those you know, in-world supplemental pieces. This is excerpted from Reasonably Satisfactory and Encouraging to All, an oral history of the reunification talks. And this is written by a peace negotiator from the federal government. And he talks, you know, about like, okay, you know, I was prepping and I was just ready to hear whatever would be on the table. And he says, in this book, then the first day of negotiations came around. I remember we were meeting in a large boardroom in the basement of the peace office. There were 5 of us on the union side, a small delegation because we had no real authority. Everything had to be approved later on in the executive building. But when the South's when the South negotiating team showed up, there must have been 24 of them. Each one had a different title: Director of Revolutionary this, Secretary of Patriotic that. One guy gave me his card. It said he was a constitutional defense officer. We thought they'd want to start with travel restrictions or amnesty for all those rebels we had sitting in the detention camps, or maybe they were desperate and would want to talk money. They'd held out for so long with their stubborn reliance on fossil fuels while the rest of the world moved on. Their cities were falling apart, and we thought we could get them to make all kinds of concessions in exchange for infrastructure money. But I still remember the very first day, their chef de mission sits at the table, pushes the agenda aside without reading it, and says to us, first things first, I don't want to hear a single one of you ever use the word surrender. Turns out they didn't give a damn about travel restrictions or prisoner swaps or any of those things. For 3 days straight, all they wanted to do was haggle over the wording of the Reunification Day speeches and the preamble of the peace agreement.
Absolutely.
And then at the very end, he goes along and he says, you know, in the end, Columbus went along with it. And even today, all these years later, we live with the consequences. They didn't understand. They just didn't understand. You fight the war with guns. You fight the peace with stories. And I think that's really interesting.
It is. And it's a question that I ask, like, It is true to an extent, and it's also true that that's knowing South and I've met like even Southern politicians, like, yeah, that's accurate. Like, we're gonna need this and we're gonna need that, and you're gonna stick out your hand first, and it's
Right.
all, inverted hospitality into this horrifying.
It's such pageantry.
Yeah, oh, absolutely, literal pageantry. Yeah, but it is interesting talking about we fight the war with guns, we fight the peace with stories, and the idea of, okay, we now make this mythology around the war, just like we've made the mythology around every war we've ever fought in this country. And where does that take us? Where does the mythology around our Civil War that we, are the actual, Civil War,
right?
Where does that leave us? Well, I mean, Joss and I know we see fucking Confederate flags all the time. I see them like almost daily. Like it's, and that the stuff that comes with. I know what I was taught in classrooms in my high school was called it the War of Northern Aggression. But that's still that terminology gets thrown around that allows for that sort of radicalism, and that right-wing radicalism, that alienation, all of that feeling of we were wrong, that feeling of, this, that, and the other. And that the idea of like, these things are going to continue on because the war is, not over. One wonders how much capacity there is to fight anything after 100 million people die. But like the idea is, yeah, this story is not going to be one where it's not going to be. Yeah, it's not going to be.
It's still burned into my memory from like fourth grade is this apocryphal story that we learned in when we were learning about the Civil War about Robert E. Lee giving water to a wounded Union soldier.
What?
Right? And it's just like
I heard that one. Yes.
Yes, exactly. And where the soldier's like, hurrah for the Union, and it's like, he's portrayed as kind of the spiteful guy, who's like the sore winner or whatever. And it's like, why do we need to hear this story? Why does it matter that that this guy was that
he was so noble?
Yeah, it's he was a slaver, and he fought for the disenfranchisement of Black people like long after the war ended. And that's where right before the end of the excerpt that you read, this really stood out to me. I think I think it's my standout phrase for here. I told the president's people, if we go along with this, if we nod and smile while they parade some fantasy about this being a noble disagreement between equals and not a bloody fight over the stubborn commitment to a ruinous fuel, the war will never really be over. Because that's the thing, it's the compromise of 1877 all over again. It's the end of Reconstruction. It's pulling out federal troops that were preserving the integration of Black Americans into the political and public sphere, right? It's this allowance of the South to create this lost cause mythology that is still perniciously around and has to be constantly dismantled and fought against. And that's what the thesis of this book contends with. This is a country that has never been allowed to heal and is actively, in fact, resisting it.
I think, though, that there is one piece that he misses here, because he's exactly right about the narratives, and again, you go back to Reconstruction, you're exactly right. So much of it was the lost cause narrative and the fact that it persevered even after the Civil War. But the reason that was able to happen was, of course, because of the material conditions, right?
And that is missing, yes.
And because, that is every bit as important. It is what did or did not happen to these plantations, what did or did not happen in terms of equal protection of the laws. And it was policy decisions being made by the Johnson government that allowed all of that to happen. It wasn't as if the story would have continued to have the same purchase had Reconstruction gone through in the way originally envisioned. And so this misses the point on that a little bit. And I don't know if it's just, his understanding of American history or his understanding of what happens in geopolitics, or if it's just that he wanted to, do a cute little metaphor. I'm not sure, but it does feel like it misses the mark just a little bit.
It does. It feels a little bit like it's like if we took down all the Southern general statues, then everything would be fine. Right. Which was obviously obviously, and of course they should take down the Southern general statues, no doubt. And then they took down some of them. Of course, I don't like that there are middle schools in Georgia named Robert E. Lee Middle School or Jefferson Davis Middle School. That's terrible. But that's not, if you removed that there's still going to be fucking racism. There's still going to be poverty. There's still going to be climate change. So that is where you reach that contention, and that is where you kind of hit the liberalism of the book.
Yes.
You hit it there, and you also hit it when you are talking about these governments without talking much about like capital interests, because you don't, despite having some like, there's some rich guys out there, like, yeah, that's definitely a thing that's in the ether, but there's not a lot of discussion over, okay, where is capital siding in this war? I mean, like maybe oil capital, but it's gone by the time this book's like narrative is even important. So that's kind of washed up. Now, I could see an interesting book of like, where it's a book about oil oligarchs launching an insurrection, and maybe it just doesn't touch on that, and he has an idea that there's a lot more of that money going into this. There's not a lot of discussion of that, but yeah, the class nature of it, and of course some of that just comes down to the fact that these characters are not workers, like we were saying. They just don't have jobs. And when later in the book, when Simon and Karina have their house, it's just like they're kind of selling their produce that they grow. They're like subsistence isn't the right word, but they're selling off just what they grow. They're not really workers, as in working for a wage.
Well, they don't need to be, because their entire life is paid for by the generosity of the public, who see them as heroes, and so they're just going to have all the money they ever need. Right,
and it's a weird, and it's a weird, like, if not omission, then definitely like a weird thing that like I wish it had looked into more. And the writer, he might have just been like, well, that wasn't the point, and it's like, that's fair enough. But when you are looking at these conditions on such a big scale, one does wonder, like, okay, where's the money at? Where's the,
But I think also for him, the precision of that stuff is less interesting to him than just the general role reversal of what if you were the occupied empire? What if it was a great big foreign empire somewhere else that was calling the shots for how you live? That's really fundamentally what he's interested in.
That is true. And of course it's an interesting, and it's an interesting thing to think about, and it's an interesting thing to engage with. I just, it definitely, is worth thinking about and deconstructing. And it's like, okay, so what is the, form of this government? How much of, because one gets the impression that the Southern government actually is basically running everything in the South, like all the industry and stuff. I don't know if that's actually the case or not. But I was like, have they completely nationalized all their industries for the war? I don't know.
Yeah, it seems to be like a mixed-ish economy with fascist characteristics.
Definitely that
appears to be the nature of the economy. But yeah, I mean, if he were the kind of writer who, I imagine if he were an economics journalist rather than a combat journalist, there would be big, long pieces about how the economy is structured,
Then this would be a ministry for the future, but
We'll put a pin in that, and that's the thing, right? He's again, it's not necessarily about war in that sense, in that economic.
It's about ruin.
It's about yes.
Am I right?
And to come back to that, he's much more interested in what it does to individuals and how sort of your individual spite, your individual trauma can sort of reignite these. Because remember, we kind of glossed over it earlier, but her killing of the general sort of puts a pause on peace talks that are intended to take place. Right. And this stuff is it chugs along the war a little more. And it's here, it's a further sort of act of spite that's not even for the South's benefits. I'm referring to the final decision that she makes, which is she's approached by Yusuf, and Yusuf tells her, that I come from this empire that's here we go. My people have created an empire. It's young now. We intend it to be the most powerful empire in the world. For that to happen, other empires must fail. And what he's proposing to her is, Yusuf has made contact with the guy who thought he had a cure for the plague that destroyed South Carolina, but the cure ended up, it was the slow plague, right? And the cure ended up inducing some kind of like frenzy that kills people instead.
Yeah, it was the COVID vaccine.
Yeah.
Yes, they had a glorious moment of like 10G, and then the internet crashes their brains.
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah,
just proteins shedding everywhere.
And he comes to her. He's like, "Hey, I've made contact with this guy who has this serum that'll create in somebody this even worse plague, and we want you to be the vector for that plague. Go north to the reunification celebration in Columbus, Ohio, where the American capital has moved to, and unleash this, right? Because that's the thing, right? Reunification to Yusuf presents this sort of threat that's like, oh, even the United States, like even in its sort of crippled state, even in its blasted and barely reunified state, there's still this like specter of its resurgence that he wants to prevent, which is interesting to me, because I'm not really sure that I mean, obviously Yusuf's the villain here, and one sees spite from there, certainly, but one also sees spite in what Sarah is doing, because as I said, she says
naturally, yeah,
because she says fuck the South and everything it stands for. She's offered what is she offered exactly by the Braggs at Stone Mountain?
She gets offered a star that's like a symbol of like a medal that was never given out.
Yes,
right.
That?
Yes,
Yeah, it's like a shitty pin, and she's like, I don't want your pin, fuck you.
It's like naturally.
Exactly. She's been kind of chewed up and spit out, which is an interesting irony to me. She is, because she's at Stone Mountain is where she's talking to the Braggs after this offer has been extended to her, right? Stone Mountain, as we know, birthplace of the Ku Klux Klan twice, once 100 years ago, the second time in like the 60s, 70s. It's a symbol of reaction. It's a symbol of white supremacy historically.
We literally dealt with some like neo-Confederates there like a month ago. Like they had their big old conference and fired off cannons and shit. Like it's happening all the time.
It's just
And I don't know that we actually mentioned that Sarah is black.
Yes, and that's the supreme
we
irony
probably
here.
should have mentioned that earlier in the episode. That like so much of also what's going on, the dynamic here is it is agents of white supremacy using her to further the ends of what is presumably a racist fascist state, although again that is not a piece that the author is quite as interested in expanding upon, which I think is to the detriment of the specificity of this work.
It doesn't really go into it. It is there.
And it's interesting because I'm not sure what to do with it thematically in that case if he's not interested in interrogating it, right? Because here's here at the gates of Stone Mountain, at the gates of the symbol of reaction of white supremacy, you have a black queer woman who's repudiating the South and everything it stands for. And yet she goes on to, because it's not a revolutionary act that she goes on to do. Right. No. It results in the deaths of 110 million people purely because of what the North did to her. Right.
Yeah. And deaths not just in the North, deaths everywhere,
in the South,
across the whole continent.
All over,
she warns her Layla Jr., her old friend and like old lover, like, hey, just so you know, everyone's about to die. That comes
right. She gets her nephew Benjamin, who was narrating this book. We remind you,
sends him up to Alaska.
She ships him out to Alaska by way of the Mexican protectorate out west. But other than that,
throws in there very briefly that he becomes like a weird little reactionary too, because there's immigrants coming in and he screams immigrants go home and says he attacks their houses, and he was like, and it made me feel, the idea of that continuing
their unbelonging was proof of my belonging.
Exactly. And I don't and she has this brief moment where it looks like she might have some redemption with Benjamin. One could even say that like her one bit of redemption is her relationship with Benjamin, but that the pain matters more. Obviously, there's this she has this moment in the water with him where they're together and she's trying to overcome her fears. And I guess the idea behind that is the book doesn't want to immediately go from prison to her doing the mass killing. Like, it doesn't want to say, and there was no human left, there was no choice left to be made. I think the book wants to make it clear, like, there was still a choice left to be made, and this was the decision she made. It is I don't know quite what to do with that whole part of the book. It's not huge, but where she's dealing with Benjamin, there's a few parts in that are actually kind of weirdly written, where it's like him saying I, and then it switches and he's no longer on the page anymore. She walks inside the church. Explains later he had her diaries to make sense of everything. But I don't dislike it. I think there's like some interesting parts. I think Benjamin is is compelling. I don't know exactly what Benjamin's role in the narrative, like of the point of the narrative, like if he's trying to drive something home with Benjamin, what Benjamin represents. I guess just the next bereaved generation.
Oh no, go ahead.
Well, because it's kind of because he has her diaries, right? He gains access to them. He gains access to a note that she writes to him, her last kind of communication with him before she goes off and she does this horrible thing. And in it, right, she writes, I told you once that a well-set bone grows stronger. The opposite is also true, right? So she's saying, okay, this is what makes sense to me that I'm doing because of what I've endured, which, and I don't really buy the validity of that. But what he does is he burns her diaries, right? And he says it was the only way I had left to hurt her, right? Because and he's saying, she hasn't just done this thing, but her last act of cowardice was forcing me to understand her, forcing me to choose what to do with the secret. But that's the thing, he doesn't hide her complicity in this. He doesn't hide her responsibility for this, because he's presenting this to the public as like a historical document, right? So it's in a way he's trying to diffuse, I think, this cycle of vengeance, right? For the public, if not against her, right? Because it's the vengeance that he takes is specific, it's tailored, but it's also with a view toward healing that divide.
Well,
good.
Another thing that burning the diaries allows the character of Benjamin to accomplish is that he now is the guardian custodian of Saret's story. Nobody else has the ability to read her diaries and get an alternate interpretation because, and I think it's actually kind of clever that like it leads us in this place at the very end. You're like, wait, so we just have to take his word for all this shit.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean? Like his interpretation of this story might not be totally correct. There might be pieces of her journals that are salient points that were left out entirely. This is a fundamentally subjective document. And I think that's really clever because of the way that it then, when you get to the end, you're like, oh, all of those interspersed bits and pieces of the secondary documentation. The point of that, yes, is to provide sort of an in-world grounding for what's going on, but it's also to show you how his understanding of this person, of his aunt, is different from everything that everybody else knows. And that for him, there's an excitement of taking that narrative, making it his own, and bringing forward what he sees as the truth. And I think it's really cool, actually.
Yeah, no,
because he's the one to curate it. Yes,
right.
Going back over the text too, it also led me to have a slightly amusing experience of every now and then there'd be a tiny detail of like she took another spoonful and it's like you just made that shit.
Yeah,
up.
exactly.
It's like maybe. But at the end of the day, what we don't talking about, obviously it's in the central motif is there are stories and stories pass on, and that's what we receive. And there's also the interesting fact of this 100 million person plague destroyed so many records. So, the idea of what records there might be on her at the prison or whatever between climate change and the plague, like we're going to have to go on the person's word for it in a very more archaic sense, in a way that the digital age maybe doesn't make us do as much, which, I agree. It's strong. I wanted to just, before I forgot to do it, read a quote that I really connected with. I felt like it was a really strong description of the vengeance of Saret, and it brought the water motif home. It's when she's killing Bud the guard. And it says, and it's talking about her bleeding him, literally bleeding him to death. And it says, she took it all, speaking of blood, rising. She looked at the hollowed remains of the guard, and she felt the inverse of fulfillment, the empty undoing of the castaway who, rabid with thirst, resorts to drinking from the ocean. And that's where you get the water motif back, right? And you get the, like, she's not in this wholesome water anymore. And she's not in this situation where she's not even unaware of what she's doing. She's looking at the ocean and she's like, it would be better to drink that and just fucking die. And that's what brings this thing home. And that's, and there's no Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
Well, it's the conclusion of such an interesting arc for her too, because we see a number of kills along the way, each one of which is sort of more precisely calibrated and personal. You know, back in the camp, after she has survived the massacre, she sneaks up behind a guy who is just out to take a leak. One of the soldiers who crossed in, you know, and slits his throat. This is sort of an act of self-defense, right? This guy could potentially be a credible threat to her, but it is still, it's a little personal. By the end, she's having the opportunity to take out the architect of her personal torture for years and years and years. But along the way, none of that violence makes her feel more whole. All she feels is just a letting out more and more of herself. And exactly like what you're saying with the water motif, it's precisely the opposite of what she wants and needs. So I guess she is ruined. I guess Omar El Akkad was right. This really is a story about ruin and how she is ruined by that vengeance that she seeks and gets, but to what end?
And her whole life has been, you know, defined. The water, just to take it a step further, her whole life has been defined by this like relationship to water and walls, you know, the rivers that she lived on. You know, when she was at Sugarloaf Prison trying to strain to hear the water and being waterboarded, the time that she spent time by the river and by the wall, both in the refugee camp and then again in the house that she lived in, that was like sort of given to her as like compensation for having been in the refugee camp. And her like, and there's like definitely something about nature in there too, because nature is, you know, as humanity has destroyed nature, nature is destroying humanity back. You know, the unstoppability of water, you know, notably Savannah is gone, downtown Savannah is underwater. Notably from, I literally honeymooned in Savannah, so that was like a interesting thing to throw out there. But like, it's coming. It's I don't know everything about environmental science, but it seems like that's where we're headed for in the next few decades.
I don't know if it's on the schedule that this book predicts, but we're going to get there.
It's happening, yeah, and that's what and so she's reefed in by all of these things, and it talking about like her, you know, making this final choice to drink the salt water, to basically be like the ruin of the ocean is coming in. It destroyed the land that's like to the south of her. It has really ruined their country. She is going to drink it too. So yeah, I'm coming more and more around on that not war, ruin line, even if it is a little melodramatic.
Yeah.
I'm at least getting, I at least get it a little more. Yeah, and that's, you know, that's kind of where it leaves off. It doesn't, you know, there's still a country, there's still a Congress, so, you know, they have congressional hearings in the future. There's still a world. This is not a book that is a guy saying, and I'm the last guy alive. We do not know what kind of world it is. We don't know if the disease maybe got outside the country or not. We don't know how far climate change progressed even further. We're not sure. And that's not the point. But the point is, this is a trajectory for the United States, not if not literally, then in a sort of spiritual sense. And it's like a, you know, it's a pessimistic one. It's one that works individually and on a societal level. It's about radicalization. It's, of course, about climate itself. And ultimately, you know, there's the imperialism in it as well. And it makes for, I guess it feels like a cautionary tale, I guess is the best way I could describe it.
Cautionary, yeah, because of what it ends on, right? The only bit of Saret's diary is that he doesn't burn, right? When I was young, I lived with my parents and my brother, my sister, a small house by the Mississippi Sea. I was happy then. Smash cut to credits, right? And that's what we're left with. You know, she was happy, and then, you know, her entire life is a series of traumatic events that breaks her down, and eventually, you know, she comes to that point where the last thing she does is she's the vector for this horrific plague that's like 10 times worse than COVID, right? And that's the thing, like the work of, I mean, that's something to do with, I think, why we don't necessarily see a lot of what goes on with the rest of the world, right? We don't get a sense of any organizing that's going on. We don't get a sense of any sort of geopolitics going on outside of the United States. We get a sense of being siloed off from everything else. We get a sense of the world turning its back on us. No real proletarian internationalism going on. The only thing we get from the rest of the world is its cast-offs, right? And it's deep loneliness on a geopolitical scale, certainly, but also on an individual scale. And this idea that can defeat any kind of interconnectedness, right? That the pain and that the suffering and that the trauma of one person can undo the work of who knows how many millions that we don't even get to meet.
Yeah, I guess here's a question.
Hmm?
Do you buy that? Or do you think it is ultimately a short-sighted, unrealistically pessimistic way of seeing the world?
Oh, it's absolutely unrealistically pessimistic, right? Because that's the thing, right? If you accept that, and individual choices can, not to get into any Carlylist great man theory, of history thing, but individual choices can do great damage, yes. But if we accept that we can't have nice things, and if we accept that certain people can just set things off the rails, then that's it. Then there's no reason to continue to struggle for nice things and to build relationships, right? That's it's a world devoid of revolutionary optimism is this book, right? Or at least the corner of the world that we're exposed to.
Mm-hmm. But I think it is in the sense that it is a cautionary tale, and it's it is a sort of these grains, if this strain of things is allowed to, if in a world where, that pervasive, don't tread on me bullshit, got to be a whole country.
Literally, there's a rebel flag there's a rebel militia flag that has a snake on it. Yeah,
right. Then so it would go. But yeah, if someone told me, not only did I think this book was realistic, I think this is what's going to happen, I would call that person a pessimist. Mm-hmm. What Omar El Akkad intends specifically to tell us, whether he intends to caution us or to just be yeah, no, man, this is it, or this is the most likely outcome, I couldn't exactly tell. I couldn't exactly tell from some of the stuff I read that he said. He's, definitely seen some shit, reporting on Guantanamo and Afghanistan that definitely has colored his perception. But Ferguson. I think, in Ferguson. And I think ultimately, though, from my perspective, this doesn't, I don't think, I know that this doesn't have to happen, and nothing like this happen.
Right.
Bad things will happen, that naturally, but there is real potentiality. There is a lot of potential across the country, across the world, in the South specifically. I organize every single day in the South. I see how much passion there is. I also this is a very small note because I know it's not the point, but also the idea that the whole city of Atlanta would be on board with this is spent a lot of time in Atlanta.
Right.
Atlanta is actually would be much more in line with the North. That's actually kind of the more of what the contradictions look like in the South, urban versus rural. But yeah, no, this is not going to happen if we don't allow it to happen. And I think Joss and I might talk about Ministry for the Future by Kim Stanley Robinson next week, because it is almost have either of y'all read Ministry for the Future?
I have not.
I've read the first little bit of it.
It's I guess this book is its Wario, basically. It's hey, what if we did it's actually a lot more science oriented, but it's what if we had the good ending? And we did good things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, things certainly get worse before they get better, but they do get better.
Yes. So I think we should talk about that at least soon. But I really do foresee that. But absent actual organizing and actual work and actually people giving a shit, yeah, this could happen. And this is a useful cautionary tale, but I would not tell someone read this and get a vision of the future, because I don't believe that that's the future that's coming. Not if I have anything to say about it.
Yeah.
What do you think?
To the extent that there exists any kind of human nature, people have something to say.
Mm-hmm. The South got something to say. We like to say that. Yeah.
Josh,
I guess
do you have any kind of final thoughts on the book or on that?
I think I fall pretty much where you do. There are images in this book that, in terminology in this book, ideas like the mag, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, the mag. For some reason, that's one of those things that sticks with me. Is like you could have that's real, you know. The images of Sarah being dragged around this horrifying facility out on an island, which is all that remains of the state of Florida, and all they do there now is torture people. It's like there are things like that where it's like, wow, that's so wild, that's so specific, that will never leave me. But even so, I do also see this more as we could end up there in some world. I don't think that's where we're headed, because frankly, I can't have that. I refuse to have that. I refuse to allow that, just like the two of you. I also think it's interesting, you know, that you come at it from the perspective of being, you know, from and in the South, whereas I myself have always been, you know, a good Yankee boy. But I see in this a lot of accuracy in terms of how it understands that culture and things about that culture. It would be interesting to read a book like this about what's happening in the North and, you know, what that looks like. But ultimately, yeah, I'm really glad. Thank you both for, you know, having me on, giving me a chance to talk about this
for coming on
book that I honestly think I love, but also have like real issues with, and gave me a way to sort of unpack that. I really appreciate it. So thanks, guys.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Happy to have you on. And you know, the last thing I'll note is the mag. When you're talking about that, I was like, "Where's Florida?" Oh, right.
Yeah.
And I thought that was funny, but yeah, Florida in the 2080s, 2090s, still managing to torture people. Crazy how that works.
I mean,
well, I mean, if it were around, it would ruin the acronym.
That's true. Where the hell do you? I'm not quite sure.
Bangamathga, like
add South Carolina in there. It doesn't work. It's a mess. It's a mess. Got to keep it simple. Keep it simple. Okay. Well, yeah. Thank you so much for coming on, Josh. We really appreciate you. Yeah, to those who are listening, Ministry for the Future is probably going to be next. If we're still like on Twitter in a couple weeks,
we'll see. I just got a message from Brian, my co-host, that apparently Twitter is now like you just can't get into it if you don't have a registered account in any way, shape, or form.
It's just fucking broken. Yeah,
so,
I don't know what's next. I don't know what our podcasting home is. Already, the majority of our followers aren't on Twitter. They don't follow us on Twitter. But yeah, Josh, seeing as Twitter's not going to be a great place to plug anything, if you would like to plug anything, now would be a great time to do that.
Absolutely. So if this has very much been a case study in the pop culture of a dying empire, and we do those every single week over on our show, The Worst of All Possible Worlds. Every week is a deep dive into a different piece of media. We talk about movies, we talk about video games, we talk about TV shows. Every once in a while, we talk about books, but Brian and AJ are illiterate, so we only do that rarely. If you are interested in more information about our show, you can go to worstpossible.world. That is our website. You'll find information there. We are, for the time being, on Twitter at TWOAPW, and you can also follow us on Blue Sky at worstpossible.world. So that's my pitch.
Oh yeah, it's a great show. I literally introduced it to Joss. We were on the way back from a protest at this ICE detention facility. We had like an hour and a half, and I was like, "You got to listen to this Left Behind episode, dude."
Yeah.
Oh yeah. We do love our evangelical culture.
We did a Left Behind episode on our podcast because that
on the book specifically.
So
yes,
for me.
Yes, as did we. Yeah.
And like I literally can't walk into a room, not know where someone is, and be like, "Oh shit, Rapture."
Yeah,
but yeah, absolutely.
Episode coming out this week on God's Not Dead, the motion picture. So
no way, that's awesome.
Oh, yeah.
Awesome. And by awesome, I mean horrible.
So by the time you listen to this, that might already be up. So yeah.
Well, yeah, everybody go check it out. Appreciate y'all for listening as always. Joss, do you have a book specific sign off to this one?
So many possible shells, but we're the socialist one.
There you go. That's the parody of the song.
Good.
That could work.
It's good.
There we go. There we go. That works.
That's been banging around in my head for days.
It's good to get something like that out.
There we go. Yes. All right. Appreciate y'all. You have a good one. Bye.
All right. Peace out.